All right, this is part two in my Introduction to Parasitology lecture. The making of a parasitologist is this part. So, one of the things that I love the most about parasitology is that in order to be a good parasitologist, you need to be really integrative. And what that means is you need to have knowledge of a lot of different types of information in order to do what you're doing well. And in my opinion, this keeps science from getting boring and allows me to learn lots of new stuff, which I really love. And this point was very well illustrated in a presidential address to the American Society of Parasitologists given in 1946 by President of the Society at the time, Chandler, and the talk was entitled The Making of a Parasitologist. So the big question in this talk was, well, what makes a good parasitologist? Well, first he points out that parasitologists are doing science, so they need to be able to do what science involves, which is hunt for new pieces of information and collect new facts, make sound conclusions from these facts, and apply these conclusions to solve a new problem. So first, you need to be able to do the thing that science is. Then you need to be a good scientist, because parasitologists are a type of scientist. And in his mind, to be a good scientist, you need to be keen of intellect, sound of judgment, able to make observations so that you can potentially put together, you're just generally able to make good observations. Imaginative, so that you can potentially put together two pieces of seemingly disparate facts, or two seemingly disparate facts, and to be able to create experiments that are cleverly done. You need to be persevering and industrious. Science sometimes involves a lot of hard work and long hours, and you need to be able to handle that. And you need to be endowed with a more than normal amount of initiative and resourcefulness. This is already kind of sounding like a tall order, and he's saying this is just what you need to be a good scientist. Now, if you want to be a good parasitologist in particular, well, there's a long list of traits that you need to have to do that. First, you need to have a large capacity not just for hard work, but for hard and dirty work, emphasis on dirty. He also mentions that you need to have an ability to read German, French, and Latin, because at that time there were large parasitology communities that were writing in German and French, and Latin is useful for understanding Latin names, for example. And there was also a lot of research, and still is, in the languages of Italian, Russian, Spanish, and Portuguese. So I myself am not very good at any language that is not English. I can speak a little Spanish, but not much. But fortunately, this requirement has been replaced by an ability to read Google Translator. Thank you very much, Google. And I have put many papers through Google Translator to try to figure out what my Spanish-speaking colleagues are up to, for example, and my Russian-speaking colleagues. You need to have a good command of the English language, because not only do you need to communicate your results to other scientists by writing papers and giving talks, but you also need to be able to write about how brilliant your ideas are and how important your research is so that you can get money, you can get funded, so you can get grants funded, and so that you can influence legislation if you are working with human pathogens, for example. You need to have a knowledge of chemistry so that you can understand biochemical reactions that might be important in your system. You need to understand how to prepare culture media, and if you're working in the field of parasitology that's involved with creating medicines to deal with parasitology or to avoid or to give you immunity against parasites in the first place, then you need to understand pharmacology and therapeutics. A knowledge of physics is useful in connection with microscopy so that you can understand the effects of light and heat and moisture and the effects of surface tension. So need to know a little bit of physics there also. Mathematics is useful to know so that you can run statistics on your results to figure out how significant they are. You also need mathematics so that you can form models of your system so that you can try to understand the dynamics better. So in that case, you need differential equations and some algebra. It's also useful to know mathematics to understand logarithms, etc. You also should be familiar with taxonomy. Parasites come from a lot of different taxonomic groups, and they affect hosts in lots of taxonomic groups. And in fact, even if you're just studying human parasites, you should be familiar with taxonomy and zoology, because a lot of human parasites are vectored. So, for example, a mosquito can carry the disease and give it to humans by biting you, and that's a case of being a parasite or pathogen being vectored. Or some parasites and pathogens are trophically transmitted. So, for example, if you eat a fish, you can get infected by something. So you need to understand mosquitoes, fish, crustaceans, etc., even when you're studying human parasites and pathogens. You need to understand ecology so that you can understand what's going on in the system, how the animals get infected, what their habits are, where they live, Geography is important because parasites are found in certain geographic regions and not others, and understanding something about geography can help you understand where to put resources if you're trying to fight a parasite or a pathogen. Anatomy is useful so that you can find and identify the different places that parasites are infecting you or are infecting their hosts, or figure out the pathway that the parasites take in order to get to their final resting spot in the host. You need to be able to do a little bit of histology and understand that so that you can have a better idea as to what's going on in the host and take a peek at what's going on inside. You need to understand physiology so you can understand how parasites are affecting their host, for example. The list goes on. So there's pathology, embryology, development, nutrition, climate and meteorology, heredity or genetics, immunology, bacteriology, and virology. There's lots of interactions between bacteria and viruses and parasites. So you need to understand those. You can understand these potential interactions. You need to understand microscopy and sterilization techniques and husbandry and cultivation techniques. And husbandry, in case you don't know, husbandry is the taking care of animals in the lab. So sometimes you have to be able to keep multiple animals in the lab so that you can maintain life cycles so that you can study them. So this is a pretty tall order, and it pretty quickly starts to sound a little bit overwhelming. How is one person to understand all of these different areas? And so Chandler kind of tries to calm you down a little by adding a line in his speech saying, I believe that anyone who can be called a parasitologist should be thoroughly grounded in some of these fields and have had at least an introduction to most of them. So you don't necessarily need to be a total pro in all of these different areas, but having a little bit of knowledge in all of these areas and a lot of knowledge in a couple will help you to be a good parasitologist who can think about things and attack a problem from multiple different directions. Finally, he provides a bit of a warning to get the potential weaklings out of the group. A parasitologist, he says, must inevitably, if he is not exclusively a malariologist or a chemotherapist, spend many uncomfortable hours performing autopsies on animals that are not always freshly dead, in wallowing in blood or intestinal contents, in spending whole afternoons with the excreta of man or animals, or in tramping through swamps and jungles in search of snails or insects. A man or a woman who hates bad smells, avoids blood and filth, or shudders at dirty hands cannot be a full-fledged parasitologist. This also happens to be one of the things I love about parasitology. Not the excreta of man or animals part so much, but the tromping through swamps and jungles and spending long hours at the microscope. This all is actually very appealing to me. So, if you're going to be a parasitologist, you can't be a wimp. So parasitology as a field has had a lot of boosts during wartime. And the reason for this is because during wartime, we send our young men and women to areas where they haven't encountered the parasites in that area before. So they'll go to a new area and all of a sudden they'll start feeling sick. Perhaps they have malaria and now they have fevers and chills and stomach aches. Or maybe they encounter a filarial nematode and now they have elephantiasis, which means their legs are swelling up. And they're encountering all sorts of things that either make them feel bad or are just generally horrifying. So when our men and women report back home or send letters back home about all these horrifying things, we decide that we're going to throw money at parasitology and we send parasitologists over there. And so historically, the field of parasitology has gotten a lot of boost during wartime, and parasitology departments, for example, get started during wartime. More grant money is available and more people generally are recruited into the field of parasitology. And I think that this point is well illustrated by by a graph that I got off of Google Ngrams. So Google Ngrams is a program that searches all English language texts, and then you can search for a word or a set of words, and it will tell you the frequency of that word in all English language texts. And if it hasn't gotten all English language texts, then it will try to sample them in a way so that certain subjects aren't overrepresented, so that you can get a good representation of how popular that word was. So for example, if you search the word parasite, the word parasite the frequency of the use of the word parasite increases rapidly around World War I and World War II and the Vietnam War. So these are all wars in which American soldiers went to areas they hadn't gone before and came home with horrible diseases. And in fact, interestingly enough, if you follow the trend for malaria, which is a disease that people get when they're bitten by a mosquito, and it causes soldiers, for example, or whoever is infected by it, to have fevers and to need to be confined to beds or to hospitals. And in fact, in World War II, in some regions, so many men were confined to hospital beds that we were having trouble getting enough men on the field to fight the battles. And so we threw a lot of money into figuring out how to treat and prevent malaria, and we ended up coming up with different medications and different prevention methods, for example, pesticides, to cut down on mosquito populations that vector this disease. And this was in World War II, we threw so much money at this problem, you can see, we threw so much money at this problem that by the time you get to the peak for Vietnam War, you don't get a similar peak in malaria, and that is because it was less of a problem, because in World War II we had come up with a lot of different solutions. So anyway, parasitology has not been getting a lot of money lately because we haven't been sending men and women into areas where there are diseases that haven't been encountered or to some extent studied in the past. But you can find money still for some particular topics. And so I will be talking about, for most of the rest of my talks, parasites of fish. And fortunately, this is an area where there is some amount of money because fish are very important for economic reasons, either to feed people or for recreational purposes. And so whenever you have a topic or an area that is very important economically, you're more likely to be able to get an influx of money in there. So if you have a parasite that is affecting a fish hatchery and millions of dollars are being lost by many of different hatcheries, then it's easier to get money to study that problem. So we know a fair amount about fish parasites, and in the coming lectures I will talk about different parasite groups, and my examples will involve parasites of fish, because I happen to study fish and it's something that we happen to know a lot about. And that is the end of this lecture.